Heads up, Kerbal Nauts, I'm afraid that we've got a slight problem. Tutorial part 3 has been delayed as we are actually needed to conduct a real mission. Due to an unfortunate case of food poisoning at the Kerbal Space Centre, we are currently the only people even remotely qualified to perform an extremely urgent mission. Apparently the head of the Kerbal government is unable to get decent cell phone reception and he's ordered us to fix it. So we're going to be putting a satellite into orbit. Now some of you may notice a few quick differences in the interface. This is new. Kerbal 2.0 was just released hours before I started recording this, but we're not going to look at that now. There is a man out there who has crappy coverage from his provider. We need to get this fixed. Okay, so straight into the vehicle assembly bay. Now we have all the information in the first two parts of this tutorial to be able to complete this mission. All we need to do is put a satellite in orbit. Okay, so let's start by building our rocket. A new change from in 2.0, you don't need to put a command center or command module on as your first thing. So we're going to start by building the satellite. So we'll use the Spattypunk as the satellite core. We're going to, of course, under the Science tab, need to use the Communitron 8888. That's going to be the system that is going to provide communications and ensure that mobile phones all across the surface of Kerbin have vastly improved coverage. So we'll stick that on the offending satellite core. Try and make it a bit central, just for the sake of the look of the thing. Otherwise, the public is going to be less likely to give us more tax money. Okay, it's going to need power. For power, we have in the utility tab, solar panels. Gigantor solar arrays, probably a little bit overkill. Just a little bit overkill. Rechargeable battery bank, that will probably be quite useful, but let's put these on for now. 2 lines of symmetry, because there is going to be times when this satellite is going to be hidden from the sun by Kerbin. As such, it needs to make sure it has a battery backup so that when those solar panels are blocked, it can still operate. Otherwise, what's the use? Gigantors, overkill, but, well, let's face it, we've got the money. We've been given a very, very generous tax break on account of the fact that this is obviously going to benefit the head of the Kerbal government in no small way. So we can put those on for now. Only problem is that, well, we might have some clipping issues because when this opens, it's going to, well, clip straight into the solar panels, and we don't want that. While the game physics won't break or anything or destroy the entire thing, it'll look a bit shabby. And, god damn it, we're Kerbals. We have pride in our work. Well, we have pride in our work up until the point that it explodes, and then you blame the other guy. But either way, the point is that we need solar panels that are going to work well here. So we're going to use these because they fold out nice and compact. So we've got our satellite, essentially. 2 solar panels, 2 batteries, and communications antenna thingy. Let's go to the launch screen. And what we're going to do here is we're just going to open everything out, make sure everything works, make sure nothing's clipping through anything else. And if we can do that, then we're obviously ready to construct the rest of our mission. So I'm just right clicking on parts here. You right click on parts to bring up the context menu and that should do the trick. So these panels deploy nicely, fine, no clipping issues. There might be some slight problems if they have to rotate to catch the sun, but we can fix that. Back into the vehicle assembly building. Come on, we've got to hurry up here. Mobile phone coverage. Okay, so I'm going to change these so that they angle down slightly. And that should resolve those problems. Now one thing that we are going to need is to be able to maneuver this satellite. So we're going to go to the control and we're going to put in some RCS thrusters. We're going to do that with 4 lines of symmetry. And we're going to pop them in there and just underneath there. This will mean that we can actually rotate this monstrosity and actually make sure we can point it. But RCS thrusters require RCS fuel. So we go into propulsion, we can find that there is a variety of RCS fuel tanks. So that one's a bit too big. This one's a bit too big. This one, just about right, but there's no room. What could we do? Well, we could put it on the bottom there. It doesn't look particularly nice and it's going to have clipping problems. So if we drop it down to, say, 2 lines of symmetry. Default's back. This is one thing, if you move over something that has differing numbers of lines of symmetry, like I did with the RCS thrusters there, it will default your symmetry lines to whatever it is you've moved over. So, problem there, but we can solve that. We probably only need one of these batteries because they're quite big batteries, and we probably only need one of these monopropellant tanks because, well, the satellite isn't going to be all that problematic. Once it's orientated, it's orientated. We can always replace it later when we've got the money. Okay, so the satellite's constructed. We know that the panels can deploy. We know that we've got a power backup. And we know that we've got RCS fuel to actually manoeuvre it. And we have our mission package antenna. So, next thing to do, build the rocket. Well, we're just going to rebuild the old tutorial rocket, but with one difference. We need to make sure we have staging so that the satellite can be separated from the rocket and not dragged back to Earth. So for that, we're going to go into the structural tab, and you're going to find this, the TR2V stack decoupler. Now it's a very, very small one, so it just bolts nicely onto the bottom of the satellite there. Hang on, I've got a phone call coming in. Okay, the mission parameters have changed. Apparently we need to deploy this satellite no lower than 200 kilometers, and it also needs to be very precise orbit. The orbit can't vary by more than 5 kilometers between apoapsis and periapsis. And they want scope to be able to move the satellite further or closer as needs be further down the line. Last minute problems. Well, we can solve that. Under the Utilities tab is this, the Ion Electric Impulse System. Now, this is an extremely efficient engine that can do a lot of work with a very small amount of fuel. The only problem is that the actual amount of thrust that it puts out is tiny. So this means that it's completely useless in an atmosphere because it's never going to be able to move anything even itself. But in space, that small amount of thrust can be applied over a very long period of time, and thus mountains can be moved, just not on the ground. It does require fuel. It requires xenon, or xenon, however you choose to pronounce it. So we put a xenon fuel tank, or xenon fuel tank, under the probe, and then an ion engine under that. So now what we've got here is a satellite with solar panels to power it, a battery backup, so that when the solar panels are obscured it can still operate, RCS thrusters to manoeuvre, communications satellite dish thingy to fry the brains of Kerbals the world over, and its own little ion engine so that it can alter its orbit without us having to go up there, attach a rocket to it and send it flying off and screaming into the abyss. So, this is the stack decoupler that we're going to be using. Just to remind you, it is the TR2V stack decoupler. Attach it under the ion engine. It doesn't put a fairing on there, but that doesn't mean that it's not worked. It's still there. It's appearing in our wonderful little staging planner here. Right, so beneath that we need to put our command pod. Now we want to keep this as simple as possible, so we're just going to use the command pod Mark 1. So this stack separator means that the engine here and everything attached to it, i.e. the probe, will separate from the command pod when we tell it to. Now, another mission parameter that's been given is apparently because of issues with bad press, the Kerbal who's piloting it must be returned safely. This could present problems. I don't think safety is really known to these guys. Well, we could try parachutes. Under the Utilities tab you will find a wide selection of these parachutes. Now, these three here are all designed to be fitted onto the nose cone of a command pod. But unfortunately our nose cone is occupied by this monstrosity. So we're going to go for this one, the radial mount parachute. We're going to put 2 on there to maintain symmetry, because maintaining symmetry helps keep your rocket balanced. I wouldn't worry too much about the lack of symmetry here because, well, if we check the centre of mass, you can see it's fairly close. And by the time we've piled on all the other rocket parts, it's going to have averaged it out so that this is going to be close enough to 0 as to make no odds. Okay, we're underneath the command pod. We'll put another stack decoupler. I'm going to use the standard one. Where's it gone? Here we are, TR18A. This means that once we've got the command pod on a return course to Kerbin, we can separate it from the engines, so we're not having to carry all that weight. Because obviously if we put too much strain on the parachutes, they might break. And if they break, it would be bad. Very bad. Okay, so next up, engines, or rather, next up, ASAS. You will remember ASAS from the last episode. It is a very, very useful thing. You should always have it. Next up, we're going to basically recreate our old training rocket. So we're going to put that there. I'm going to put the LVT-45 here. It's slightly less powerful, but it has thrust vectoring, if you read the description. And thrust vectoring means that the engine is on a gimbal, so it can tilt a little bit, and it helps to make handling the ship a little bit more easy. So again, we'll put another separator on there. But I think we're going to need... I've got to choose the first part. I think we're going to need a little bit more fuel. So I'm going to put 2 of the FLT800 fuel tanks. And then beneath that, we're going to put the LVT30, because that extra little bit of power will be useful to shift all the weight of this lot. But to be honest, this one engine, having to carry 1 fuel tank, 2 fuel tank, 3 fuel tanks, an engine, a command pod, and a satellite. This one engine carrying all of that, it can do it, but I don't know, man. This ship is going to be moving pretty slow. Alright, we'll use boosters. We always like boosters. And besides, I've been meaning to introduce you to boosters for a little while now, because they are the Kerbal's best friend. There are a few ways that you can approach boosters, and we're going to do liquid fuel boosters very shortly, probably in the next episode, but today we're in a hurry, so we're going to use these solid fuel boosters. Solid fuel boosters will give you a lot of bang for your buck. They have a great thrust to weight ratio, but the only problem with them is that once you start them, you can't stop them. Once you fire them, they're firing. You can't control the throttle. You can't shut them down. The closest thing you can do is eject them, assuming that you've mounted them on some sort of separation system. And separating them while they're firing basically turns them into unguided missiles. That would be, again, bad, because they have a tendency to fly straight into whatever it is that you've just separated them from. Personally, I think they're just malicious and evil, and you know, they don't like the idea of being separated. They don't handle rejection well. So keep that in mind when you use them, but we can use them for now. So structural tab, we're looking at this. The TT70 radial decoupler. 3 lines of symmetry for this one, I think, because 2 lines of symmetry when you're using boosters tends to be awkward. You pitch a lot more easily one way than you do the other. So we'll put these about midway up. Go into propulsion, and then we use the Rockomax back solid fuel booster. Again, 3 lines of symmetry, and just put it on top of the boosters there. And this will get us into orbit with our payload, and hopefully with enough fuel to also return the pilot safely. Probably. Maybe. Well, it's conceivable. But first off, we need to fix the staging. Now, we could have these boosters firing on their own, but personally I'd rather have this engine firing as well, because that way when we eject them, the engine is already going to be going. Next thing we need to consider then, after we've moved the engine down into the same section with the boosters, is that the boosters will run out before these 2 fuel tanks do. So these 3 are the next thing to decouple. So let's add another stage here, and we'll move the boosters into that. And obviously all we've really done is copy the stage that was above it, but again, while we're in a bit of a hurry to get this thing into orbit, we can afford to take a little bit of tutoring here. Okay, so these 3 boosters and this engine fire. Excellent. After these boosters run out, we hit space, we move it up to stage 5, which ejects these boosters, but this engine keeps going. So the next thing we want to do is eject this lot after this engine's burnt through these 2 fuel tanks, and of course fire up this engine here. So we can see that this separator is next in line, as is the engine, so we put those into the same stage. You'll remember from the previous episode that means we don't need to press space twice, and as soon as we eject, the engine's firing. Next stage is to separate the satellite. And you see here that unfortunately the staging planner has said that the next stage is to separate the command pod and the satellite, which we don't want because we want to bring the command pod home. So we input a new stage and we drop that down there. Now it doesn't matter with the engine for the satellite, we put that at the top because we're going to separate the satellite before that engine's needed anyway. So again, from the bottom, boosters and engine fire. Boosters are ejected. You see here that the side boosters are all tallied. This engine and this decoupler fire. The satellite is then separated. And then finally we can use whatever's left in this tank to put the command pod back on a course and then separate the command pod. And then finally we deploy the chutes. Excellent. We need a mission flag. Let's go with satellite. Perfect. Okay. Mission flag, extremely important. Even more important than mobile phone coverage. So what we shall call this one is mobile phone / cell phone com thingy. Well, we won't let me put in thingy. We'll just put in com. So we'll save the design. We know the staging is all sorted. If you're not too comfortable with staging, go back and check the previous video until you are. We can know how we can execute our gravity turns. The only thing we're missing, have you spotted it? That's right, control surfaces, canards for the ASAS to use. So under aerodynamics, standard canard, 3 lines of symmetry. We'll put those in there. And these, provided that we don't eject them while they're burning, should just fall off nicely. So that should do the trick. Let's launch. Alright, let's open up the resources panel up there so we can see everything that's going on. Everything should be okay. We've got our payload, we've got our rocket, we've got the beautiful sky, we've got the moon there. I wonder what it's like this time of year. Okay, throttle up. ASAS engaged. Fire thrusters. Whoa, we're accelerating fast. Okay, off throttle. Now the reason I'm coming off the throttle is because, as I say, the solid fuel boosters are going to keep us going no matter what. But if we're moving faster than terminal velocity, the air resistance against the rocket increases dramatically. Now, air resistance, we'll cover it in more detail in the next episode. For now, the purpose of this episode is to get this satellite into orbit. Conservation of your fuel through careful throttling is a bit more advanced, as is things like asparagus staging and alternative angles for your launch. But for now, we're going to start throttling up again because this engine is going to have to do all the work soon. You can see the solid fuel is running out and it's gone. So we have separation. The ASAS is keeping us on par. You can see our speed is dropping now because we've lost all that thrust. But that's not hugely important because it's just dropping in line with the air resistance and it's not going to drop all the way to 0. You can see it's starting to plateau now. So it's at 13 kilometers. We want to start executing our pitch over. Pitch over quite hard. And you can see now we're accelerating again. So I did tell you this engine can lift this rocket, but obviously those boosters have got us up to 13 kilometers with most of our fuel intact, and that means they've got us out of the worst part of the atmosphere. So I'm going to tilt this back a little bit, because the rocket's weight means that it's being dragged. As you can see, the actual heading is being dragged across and down, even though we're thrusting in the opposite direction. Hey, hey. So we're looking for an altitude of about 200 kilometers. You can see we're accelerating nicely. We've got a pretty good angle. We can start stretching that angle out now, I think. So if we tilt a little bit further, and again I'm just using the F key to feather the SAS control, switching between map and standard view. Map view lets me see how the course is progressing, so now I can tilt a bit further. Now obviously you don't need to keep switching between these views, because I'm using the nav ball. I'm actually not looking at the rocket at all. All this time I'm using the nav ball, and you can use the nav ball in we're going to have to separate soon, so engaging SAS. You can use the nav ball in the map mode. Just waiting for separation. There we go. And it is advisable to do so, but I'm just switching basically to keep an eye on the staging, the fuel in each stage. So the course is coming along nicely. We're now at over 100 kilometers, so we need to start circularizing a little bit more. Our course isn't perfect along the equator, but that should be close enough. I'm going to try and move a little bit that way to even it out. Start coming off the throttle because we're approaching 200 kilometers. Keep the throttle coming down. We want to get this as precise as possible because our mission parameter only allows for a variance of 5 kilometers. There we go. So that's now on course. We're 1 kilometer over, but we're out of the atmosphere and we've got plenty of fuel left. We've got quite a circular orbit already, so it's not going to cost us too much fuel to circularize, and we should have plenty of fuel left to bring the pilot home. So as we approach the marker here, I'm just going to set up the orbital mode. So if I rotate this around, you can get a better look at how the maneuver node works. All you're basically doing is dragging in one of these directions. So say for example if I drag this up arrow, whoops, you can see that it tilts the orbit upwards. If I pull out the down arrow, you can see that it pulls it downwards. And likewise, I can maneuver it each way. So I'm just going to delete that to bring it back to standard, and then add my maneuver. So I've got to burn prograde, circularize. So point it retrograde a little. That should be close enough. 200 there, 201 there, well within mission parameters. So I turn to the blue waypoint marker thingy, engage the SAS. Once I'm bang on the money, there we are. And now it's the waiting game. But whilst we're waiting, I'm just going to show you a few things. So in the new version we have a information pane here that shows you the pilot. I'm sure these stats will come into play soon, courage and stupidity. And we have information on the craft as well. I would remind you that in the full version of Kerbal Space Program they're actually looking at you having to train your astronauts and then having stats and so forth. But I shall train you well, so you will be able to know everything before that happens. Now, why do we launch on a 90-degree heading? Broadly, the answer is because of the orbit and motion of Kerbin. Because of the way that it moves around moves around the sun, if you launch at the right time and at the right angle, 90 degrees, you basically get a little bit of a free speed boost. So launching at 90 degrees is the common way of doing it. It gives you that little bit of a boost from the way that Kerbin moves. and its rotation. So I'm going to be approaching the burn point in a little under 3 minutes. I'm going to need to expend 425 delta V. What's delta V? Well, delta V is a measure of how much useful fuel that you have. Now, how can I explain this? If you have 200 litres of fuel, you can affect a much larger change in your velocity with a light spacecraft carrying 200 litres of fuel than you could with a really heavy spacecraft carrying 200 litres of fuel. It's about momentum and inertia. It takes a lot more energy to induce a speed change in a heavy mass than it does to induce a speed change in a lighter mass. So if you imagine a really heavy ball, like a bowling ball in one hand and a golf ball in the other, you've got to put a lot more effort into moving the bowling ball at the same speed as you would the golf ball. It's the same with ships and their fuel. So a lighter ship can make a lot more of an effective use of its fuel supply than a heavier ship can. So, and in space it's all about changing your velocity, it's all about changing your speed. So delta V can be thought of as an adjusted fuel supply. So if you've got a ship that weighs 50 tons carrying 200 litres of fuel, which I know is nothing, but I'm just pulling numbers out of my backside to illustrate the point, it won't get anywhere near as much use out of it as a ship that weighs 2 tons carrying 200 litres of fuel. So they effectively have different amounts of fuel in them. The actual amount of chemical propellant in them is the same, but the use they get out of them is different. So delta V is essentially your fuel supply adjusted to account for your ship's weight. So expending 425 delta V. We're coming up to the manoeuvre node now. I'm going to start burning at about 10 seconds on this one. The idea is, again, you want a smooth burn, as smooth as possible, and you want to expend half of the delta V requirement before 0 and the other half after it, all without actually changing your throttle. That's the perfect burn. Not many people get it, but you can then adjust your orbit later. So 10 seconds, throttle up. Okay, I've let it a little bit too much there, so I'm going to ease off the throttle a bit. And see that my marker is starting to drift, so I'm going to try and keep on target there and kill it. So, burn completed reasonably accurately. We are now in orbit. Periapsis 200 meters. Apoapsis 210 kilometers. So we're outside of mission parameters. We need to lower the apoapsis. The high point of the orbit is too high. The low point of the orbit though is just right. However, I don't want to have to mess about too much with the orbit because we've not got much fuel left and we need to get Bill Kerbin home. So what we're going to do is deploy the satellite, and we're going to use the ion engine on the satellite to fix the orbit after we've got our pilot home. So press space again to go to the next stage in order to eject the satellite, or alternatively, if you're not comfortable with the staging, you can right click on the decoupler and click decouple. I'm going to do it that way just to demonstrate it for you. You notice the camera suddenly jerks, but that's because we now have two ships. You can move between them using the map button, which they're so close that you can't at the moment, or more usefully, the square bracket keys. So let's deploy the communications dish and the solar panels. Again, right click, access the menu, open the resources tab, and there she is. Disengage the SAS. Obviously this doesn't have SAS on board, but SAS can still help you. So we can maneuver this. We don't actually need the RCS thrusters, I just put them on there for a touch of realism. But if you press the R button I'm just going to stop the spin by engaging ACF, by engaging SAS. You don't need a SAS module to use SAS, but without it, the effectiveness is so small that it's only really useful on orbital stuff like this. If you use the SAS on a rocket when you're trying to launch it and it doesn't have a large thrust to weight ratio, it's just going to go all over the place anyway. So press the R key to activate your RCS thrusters, and you can see there RCS activates, it goes green, and when you press the manoeuvring keys you can see that you manoeuvre a lot more quickly, and you can see little jets coming out of the thrusters. Fans of the Battlestar Galactica reimagining will be very familiar with this effect. But you can also use RCS thrusters for docking, so aside from controlling your rotation, they can also control your relative motion. So if we go to the docking screen, you can also use RCS thrusters on SAS. Docking screen there, disengage SAS. You can see that we can go up and down. The only problem here is the centre of mass on this thing is off kilter, so it doesn't quite work. You can see that these four are firing to try and move it in the directions that you see here, but it's not quite, it doesn't want to do it. So, but this was never designed to dock, so that's not really an issue. You can see monopropellant is used up as well, so be careful when you use your thrusters. But for now, all we really need to do is turn the satellite even to point down at Kerbin, and suddenly black spots the planet over are alleviated. So we'll go to the map screen, just check the orbit's still okay. See, PAT 199 at 211. So, square bracket, back to our ship. Affecting re-entry. Affecting re-entry is easy enough. Just go back to staging here. All we need to do is burn retrograde to kill our speed. Our speed is the only thing keeping us in orbit. When you're in orbit, you are basically falling as fast as you are moving forwards relative to the curve of the planet. So if you reduce your speed, you are now not falling fast enough to keep falling over the curve. Puzzle over it for a while, it'll pop into your head. So we're lined up for the retrograde marker. I'm going to do this via map screen just so you can see what we're doing. To make sure that we've not got the satellite in our path of fire. We don't. It's a good safe distance. Throttle up, and you can see that our path now brings us nice and close to Kerbin. Now in reality we have plenty of fuel to fix that orbit, but you know, I'm a drama queen. Okay, so we've now expended all the fuel in that tank. You can press space to go to the next staging. And again, because obviously we've activated a stage out of sequence, so it's still going to activate that stage even though there's nothing left to activate. And that's the command pod ejected. So the only stage we've got left now is to activate the parachutes. If we check our trajectory, you can see that we are essentially heading towards Kerbin. So I'm just going to time warp a little bit until we hit the atmosphere. Okay, so now in the atmosphere, I'm going to deploy parachutes by pressing space. Disengage the ASAS. Now, never warp while parachuting. When you warp in Kerbal Space Program, you are doing, you're speeding up the physics, and unfortunately speeding up the physics has a tendency to amplify the forces on your spacecraft, and that can lead to things that wouldn't normally snapping. It's not pretty when it happens. The same thing happens to parachutes. So through the magic of editing, I will speed up this descent for you. There we go, deployed. Once we've got through the awesome re-entry effects, you can see the parachutes are killing our speed to a safe velocity. This prevents what I like to call a lithobraking maneuver, or an unplanned extreme velocity change event. Both of these things are not pretty. Okay, now that we've reduced down to a reasonable speed and we're close to the surface, it is safe to go into warp 2 times. But personally, I would never risk warping faster than that. Now, one other thing that the observant among you may have noticed is that the parachutes have a little icon here that is coloured. This indicates the state of the parachutes and the amount of work they're having to do. If you are trying to break too much mass moving too quickly with too few chutes, then obviously bad things happen and the chutes can't take the strain and rip off. But in this case it never got worse than a sort of mildly yellowish colour. You can see our shadow there coming in close. And it hit the ground at 4.1 meters a second. Boom! So now the only thing left to do is plant the flag. Let's go EVA. Bit of a rough landing, but that's what happens when you time warp. Now if you want to plant the flag, you just got to right click on your Kerbal and click plant flag. Ta-da! So all we've got to do now is name the site. So we'll call this ComSat 1 Landing Zone. And the plaque text shall read if we right click on the flag, we can either take it down or read the plaque. I'm a class act, I am. Okay, map screen. We can check the comm satellites. Switch to. You can also do that through the Space Center as well if you like, but of course I never usually bother. Now, let's learn a little bit about manoeuvring whilst in orbit. If you want to raise or lower your apoapsis or periapsis, you want to do the maneuver when you're at the point opposite the one you want to change. So for example here, I want to lower my apoapsis, so I execute the maneuver at the periapsis. So pretty straightforward. Now if you want to raise the other point, you burn prograde. If you want to lower the other point, you burn retrograde. So before I tell you, so let's go over these things again. This point is too high. This point is just right. How am I going to burn and where am I going to burn? The answer is I'm going to burn retrograde at my periapsis. So retrograde burn because I want to lower something, and I'm burning at the periapsis because I want to lower the apoapsis. Simple. Now, I'm not going to use the orbital planner for this. In fact, I think I am. Normally I wouldn't use the orbital planner because the orbital planner is for it's not for fine detail work like this. It's for getting you into approximately the right orbit. It's not really all that good at fine detail. So, but given the ion engine has a very low thrust, it might actually work for this. So let's give it a try. So retrograde, you can see that those two start to switch. We're making the tiniest of adjustments here. The absolute tiniest of adjustments. You can see that a mere 7 or so meters per second is all that we need. 8.4 meters a second. That's the only velocity change that we need. So let's line up to the node and engage SAS. and then we're going to warp. Alright, so we're coming into 9 seconds. Now because this is such a small amount, I'm not going to have to do too much here, because this is small even by ion probe standards, I think. So throttle up, press the spacebar to engage the stage. Oh, it's drifting a little. This is what happens when you've got an off-center of mass. But we can keep hold of that. And let's kill the engine. Now, when you're using an ion engine, it uses a lot of electrical energy as well as xenon gas. If you want to have a permanent supply, it usually takes 1 gigantor per engine to do it. But let's see how we're at. Periapsis is at 199, apoapsis at 199,836, 199,086. That's excellent. That's less than a kilometre, and it's within the 5 kilometre variance that we were given as part of our mission profile. So that's brilliant. We've completed our first assignment. We've put a communication satellite in orbit around Kerbin. The communication satellite is capable of correcting its own orbit, so it can move closer to the planet and further away from the planet as needs be. It also has manoeuvring thrusters to ensure that it can maintain its appropriate angle and relative position. So we've done a really good job here. Now load up Kerbal Space Program and try it for yourself. And next week we'll look at something a little bit different. But for now, I'm Evis T, signing off.